sprays of pink roses at our altar today, reminding us that today is the fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday. A fancy word that just means rejoice, rejoice Jerusalem. It's also called Rose Sunday. It's like we can see Easter just beyond the horizon, and we can let go of some of our penitential Lenten angst for a moment. Rose Sunday. It makes me think of that quote, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Maybe, but a 2017 study by the Harvard Business School shows that names have a little more power than we ascribe to them. We don't even know how much authority and meaning we give to a name. Have you ever wondered, for example, what your life would have been like if you had had a different name that you have? Maybe if your name were something unusual like April or Tuesday, you might have invested some time in asking this question at some point in your life. What's in a name? Right, so this Harvard Business study, what they found is that minorities who whitened their resumes got more interviews than if they had left them untendered. So if your name, for example, is an Asian-sounding name like Lei, you would get fewer interviews statistically than if your name was Luke. And similarly, the National Bureau of Economic Research showed that whiter-sounding names got more interviews than exactly identical resumes for African-American sounding names. 10-to-1 resumes to interviews for an Anglo-sounding name, 15-to-1 for an African-American sounding name when all other details were the same. What's in a name? With names, we think we know the end of the story by seeing the beginning. We've got the title and we think we've got it all worked out. Which I think is significant for our story this morning. It's one of the most famous parables in the Bible. It's one of the most famous parables in Christendom. It's the story of the prodigal son. Yes, and we know the name of the story. We've decided what the answer of the story is from the beginning by the name that we've given it, prodigal son. Prodigal is one of those funny words, one of those kind of SAT words. There's a lot of magazines and websites that have names of prodigal Christian magazines. There's even an investment fund called Prodigal Investments. It sounds a little bit like prodigy, which is a good thing, right? Someone who shows a lot of skill and ability at a young age, a lot of aptitude. Prodigy, prodigal, sort of the same, except it's not, because prodigal means someone who's a reckless spender, someone who's not very good with managing their own money. I wouldn't suggest, I'm never giving you financial advice, by the way, but if I were, I would suggest that maybe investing with Prodigal Investments might bear some review. The prodigal son, that name just by itself interprets our understanding of the story. And the thing is, when the early Christian theologians started reading these New Testament stories and writing about them and trying to understand them and preaching about them to congregations very much like this, they had a point of view about how we interpret these stories. And their point of view was something called allegory. Allegory is another one of those SAT words, and it just means that there's a one-to-one meaning, right? So in a story like the prodigal son, as we know it, there are three main characters, right? There's the father who had two sons, the younger son, the older son. And in the allegorical interpretation, the one-to-one meaning interpretation, the younger son often is meant to mean the non-Jewish people, right? The Gentile people that are coming to God. And the father, of course, is God the Father. And the older son are the Jewish people that came before. And how could they be so churlish? How could they be so shrunk in heart to not welcome the prodigal children of Israel, God's own children, back? He should be ashamed of himself for being so small in his heart. This has been an interpretation that is extremely common for many, many centuries, almost 2,000 years of having this as the basis of interpretation for Christians. And I think it makes a good point. It wants to make the point about God's reconciling love, that the grace of Christ covers everybody, and that we should welcome everyone, sinners and saints, tax collectors, everybody is welcome in the household of God, which is true. But I think there's a problem with this kind of one-to-one, this equals that, this means exactly that interpretation of the Bible, but especially where parables are concerned. Parables just resist simple allegorical, one-to-one symbolic interpretation. I think that they deal with harder concepts than that. And one of the main problems with this kind of interpretation is that it's been used for many, many centuries by Christians as Christianity became the majority religion across Europe as a way of saying, oh, those Jews, if only they would get with the program. And became part of the overall narrative of Jews not really being in line anymore with what God wants. This is a dangerous idea. And I think it puts us in a bad position. The other problem with this kind of interpretation is that it adds layers of meaning that maybe the original hearers of the story wouldn't have brought with them. The original hearers of the story were not Christians in 2019. They're coming from a Christian majority nation. The original hearers were Jews. They were Jesus' colleagues. They were his friends. They were the people he grew up with. And they have their own point of view. And Jesus is talking to them in language using images that they're going to understand. This is really pointed out for us by scholars like Amy Jill Levin. She's a New Testament scholar who is herself Jewish, and she spent a lot of time thinking about what was the point of view of the people that Jesus was talking to. What were their points of reference? What were the stories that they grew up hearing? What were the ways that they grew up understanding the way that God works in the world? She has a book that I really love called Short Stories by Jesus. And I like that because parables like this are dense the way that short stories are dense. And each line and each word has a special meaning. And we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit. But mostly she wants to help us connect with what Jesus' original audiences might have heard and strip away all those centuries of meaning and interpretation to get down to the beauty of the original, the way that you would with a piece of wood that's been painted over a few too many times. Let's start with the beginning. There was a man who had 2 sons. Well, right away, we think as hearers of the story for the first time, if you're a hearer of the story, you are familiar with what we call now the Hebrew Bible, what people then would have called the Bible, of all the stories that came before. There was a man who had 2 sons, and their names were Cain and Abel. There was a man who had 2 sons, and their names were Ishmael and Isaac. There was a man who had 2 sons, and their names were Esau and Jacob. We're already thinking about sons. We're already thinking about families. We're already thinking about what it is to be a parent with an older and younger son. We're already thinking about sibling relationships that are in conflict. In conflict, as the Bible tells it, from day one. Let's start with this younger son. This younger son is not going to inherit as much, and according to traditional law, he would have inherited 1/3 of the total property. He's a little excessive in asking for 1/2 of the property, but there's no shame in that. There's no harm in that. It's not even that atypical in the period. He wants his half now. Doesn't want to stay on the farm when he can go off to Paris. He wants to experience life. And so the father, being the loving, indulgent father, who I know that we're not supposed to have favorites. I know that that doesn't happen. But let's imagine that this one time a parent had a favorite child. And he says, of course, we take a few days and get it all together, divide it up. Here you go. Don't go too far. right when you get work. And he goes off and he lives for himself. He has a grand old time. And he spends everything down, prodigal, right? Not a good manager of his own money. It doesn't say what he's doing exactly. It's interesting that different audiences of this story hear that in different ways. For Western audiences such as ours, we often hear that as like, oh, he sinned by spending all that money down. The shame that he felt later and the hunger that he felt was all on him. I find it really interesting that different cultures that hear this story hear different things in that. A Russian interpreter says that this story could be called the story of the ungenerous society that would allow another person to go hungry in their midst. It's just a thought, but it's just another element of the story where we bring in so much of our own context into the interpretation. He spends everything down, and then because he's no longer in an Israelite type land, he's off where there are Gentiles, and so he ends up working for a guy where there are pigs. That's the only signal, and he thinks, those carob pods are starting to look pretty good. And then he begins to formulate a thought. He's living for himself, so all of his thoughts are about him, and he says, I'm hungry. I need to do something about this, and no one will give me any food. But if I go back home and ask Dad, Dad will take care of it. And he cooks up this little speech in his head. It's sort of the, Daddy, I promise that I will be more holy if you just give me a short-term loan speech. You can hear him rehearsing it. Father, I have sinned against heaven and earth, and I promise that if you let me back in the house, I'll go to church with you more often and do the dishes sometimes. I don't know that he's really genuinely repentant. Real repentance would be to say, I've done a thing that's wrong. I'm really sorry. It's more sincerity to it than that. But he's not. He walks home. You can hear him practicing his speech in his head. Father, I've sinned against heaven and earth. Just let me back in the house. And as he's a long way off from his house, you see that the father has been standing almost like he's been waiting and watching for him the whole time. How often we do that as parents. We just stand and wait and watch. Please come back. Please make good choices. Please let it work out. And so when the dream of something better comes in the form of his son coming back, he doesn't walk out. He doesn't wait for him to crawl on his knees back to the house. No, he runs out to meet his child because that's what we do. Because we love our children. Runs out to meet him. And the boy, he starts out with the canned speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and earth, but the dad cuts him off right in the middle of it. He doesn't even get to finish. He just clutches him to himself. He says, bring him the good clothes, the nice ring. Let's kill the fatted calf. Let's get this party going because I thought you were dead and here you are and I am so happy. So far, so good. What's interesting about this story is this is the last time we see this younger son. We're not going to see him again in this story because the focus of the story changes, and this is where we begin to ask the question, what should the real title of this story be? If the story of this prodigal boy ends here, we have another son. There was a father who had two sons. So, the older son, the responsible son, the one that's been managing the accounts and working in the fields and driving Dad to all of his appointments and making sure his medicine is split up Monday through Friday in those little pill counters. That son is out in the field and he hears a party coming and he says, what's going on? And he has to hear it from one of the servants. Oh, didn't you know? Your brother's back. Your dad killed the fatted calf and they're having a party. I gotta tell you, I'd be pretty angry too. I'd feel really resentful. And that's exactly what this kid is. This man, he's resentful. My younger brother squandered everything he ever got, every opportunity, all of Dad's favor, and I'm left with the lousy job. Where's my trip to Perry? Where's my fatted calf? He's so angry that as he comes back toward the house, he won't even cross the threshold. He won't even enter. I think that's one of the benefits of reading a story like this, is that instead of it being a pie in the sky allegory of heaven and earth, it's a human story. Because if we change a few details, this is a story that could have easily have been written yesterday about this moment. Not your family, I'm sure. But some families know what it is to have unreconcilable divisions, to have hurts that will not heal. I love that Jesus tells this story. It makes me feel so seen. When I was a kid, my parents divorced. I was very young, age 2 or so. And it was a bitter, acrimonious divorce. My sister and I heard things coming out of my parents' mouths that no child should ever hear about their parent. It was rough. And like a lot of kids who have divorced parents, holidays were always a big source of anxiety for everybody. For us, for my mom, for my dad, for my grandparents, whose turn is it this year, but you've got the whole thing. I don't need to rehearse this for you because I think you know how this goes. It's always very stressful. It felt like it was a wound that was never going to heal. So here we are in our story. The father goes out to find his older son. And the text says he pleads with him. He doesn't have some canned speech like the younger son does. He just has the words of his heart, the words in the Greek that are from his guts. He pleads with him from his guts, and he says, come inside. Your brother's home. And he wants to reconcile. He wants everything to be good again. And the older brother's like, no. Right? I can't just pave over these feelings. I can't just pretend like I don't feel the way that I feel. He says, listen, I've worked like a slave for you. Now he's entering the land of exaggeration, hyperbole, the way that you do when you're really on a roll. I've worked like a slave for you. He owns half the property. My brother spent all of his money on prostitutes. We don't really know what he spent his money on. Blah, blah, blah. But he's really in it now, the way that we are. He just kind of goes into it. And you never even gave me so much as a goat to hang out with my friends. One has to wonder, from the parental point of view, did you ever ask for a goat to hang out with your friends? But okay. And the father also engages in a little bit of an exaggeration. This just shows you how much emotion is happening here, right? There's a lot of feelings in this story. He says, everything I have is yours. Not 100% true, because the nicest robe and the ring and the fatted calf are all over with the younger brother, but let's set that aside for a moment. Everything I have is yours. You had only to ask, but I thought your brother was dead, and now he's alive. Please come in and reconcile. Please come in and rejoice. What's amazing about this story is that that's where it stops. It's on the threshold. It's in a liminal space, an in-between space, neither in nor out. I think this story leaves us with more questions than answers. Does the brother go in? Does he stay out? What happens when dad dies eventually? What happens next? I think that this story is not so much a prescription, but an invitation. There was a man who had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain was really good with growing grain, or really good with meat, but Abel was better with the grain. And Cain was envious of how much more God liked Abel, and so he killed him. Which, at the time, was killing 1/4 of the population, according to the story. So, that's the murder approach to family relationships. And we're not likely to murder our family members, so we may think about it from time to time, if we're being honest. But how often have we murdered their relationship in our heart? How often do we murder the relationships with other people, not just within our own family units, but across the world? I've murdered the possibility of a relationship with you now because you're something else, and I don't like it. There was a man who had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And he sacrificed both of his sons in different ways. And the children of those 2 sons continue to war today. And yet, in the Bible, it says that Ishmael and Isaac reconciled at the grave of their father. It's never too late. There was a man who had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Jacob was tricky, and he stole the birthright of the older son. Esau was not that bright, but he felt justifiably wronged, murderously wronged. And yet, as adults, when they reconnected, Jacob feared that his brother would pull a Cain on him. Esau embraced his brother and said, "Forget it, let's move on." It makes me think of that Brene Brown saying, "You all know how much I love my Brene." You can be right, or you can be in relationship. When we were in our 20s, my mom started hosting these big y'all come over Thanksgiving dinners where like every chair in the house was just smashed around like 57 folding tables. And my sister said, "You know, Mom, I've invited Dad and our stepmom and Dad's parents, my grandparents, for Thanksgiving. And they're coming. You can be right or you can be in relationship." It didn't change anything that had happened because the past is never going to be different than it was. It didn't make the people in the story different. That younger brother, he's probably always going to be kind of a jerk. He's not a guy who should date your daughter. Or your son. You can be right or you can be in a relationship. He's going to be who he's going to be. We sat down and we had dinner, and it was fine. It was nice. And we started doing that every other year. We all chose to be in a relationship. It didn't change the past. It didn't change the hurt. But we believed that there was a new possibility that could exist, and we lived into the possibility. We live into that possibility today. We want reconciliation to be like a magic button. You push it, everything is better. It doesn't work like that. It takes time. I heard my grandmother say amazing, horrible things about my mother when we were young. And 2 years ago at dinner, all of us together, Grandma said to my mom, "I'm so proud of you in the way that you lived your life." That did not happen overnight. The stories of Jesus are stories about us. They're stories about how we live together, how we are in the world. They're not pat, easy answers because Jesus is not a cheap grace kind of guy. This kind of grace is costly. And yet, what do we get out of it? The fullness of life is possible, and that is the promise of Jesus. That grace exists, and that is the promise of Jesus. That forgiveness isn't some kind of a horrible task, it's a gift. That is the promise of Jesus. What's in a name? When the name is the name of Jesus, the answer is grace, forgiveness, reconciliation, newness and fullness of life.